the cloud this time. Maybe that'll keep us from having an issue. And just dive right into our conversation today. So most of the time when I go out, and I've been working now with nonprofit clients, either in or with nonprofits for almost and one of the things that we see frequently in going in and working with organizations is that they are so busy doing, they don't have a lot of time to think about planning. And so oftentimes that results in being so busy just keeping the holes in the dam from leaking and getting bigger that they end up not really seeing very organized from the outside. And if you've seen some of the organizations that just always seem to be the ones that everybody gives money to, they just have this, they seem to be the ones that always win the grants, that always have the big donors, they have the really large fundraisers. And your organization just can't seem to make that scale, that leap into that next place. A lot of times it's because you're so busy doing, you haven't stepped back to think about a couple of different things. One, what you're doing, but also how you're doing it, and is what we're doing really actually making a difference? So as I mentioned before I got interrupted on the, my computer had a little nervous breakdown here. The thing that business owners are looking for, even though they're looking at a nonprofit and they're looking for that heart piece, they're also looking for good business sense. So they're looking for something that is really important to them and to the mission that they're trying to achieve. And so what I have identified as I've been working with literally over hundreds of clients over all across the globe, and it doesn't matter whether you're operating in Tacoma, Washington, or Kathmandu, Nepal, the same principles hold fast. And that is, there is a certain number of elements that are critically important for every organization to have. And it's not so much that they have to have each of these, which they do, but they have to have them almost built in order. So we call it the 5-factor analysis. And I'm going to go through all of these today, but the most important thing that I have found in working with organizations that are successful versus the ones that seem to struggle the most is they have a plan. And it's not just a strategic plan that they attach to grant applications. It is an actual plan. They really know where they're going. The whole team is on board and everybody is moving in the same direction, whether it's board members, staff members, all the way down to the people who are working on the front lines. Everybody knows what the plan is and everybody's pulling in that same direction. That's probably the first and foremost. Secondly is they actually know how much this is going to cost. And I can tell you that this is probably the one area that once they have a plan, if they don't have a budget that truly articulates the cost of doing business, the cost of what that building is going to cost, whatever it might be, rolled in to some sort of document that is accurate and has been validated, it doesn't really matter how many donors you have because things will go awry. The third thing, which is I think probably become post-COVID one of the most important, is outcomes. Is what we're doing really making a difference? Not are we really busy and are we producing a lot of numbers, but is it really making a difference? And do we have the team in place to really deliver on this plan, and that is deep enough in bench strength that if something happens to one person, the whole thing doesn't fall apart, which is what we often find when you've got a founder-led organization. And then the last one, of course, is the donors. The problem is many nonprofits is that they start with donors first, and they think, I just have to find enough donors and I can build all the rest of this. Unfortunately, when you start at the top and you don't have the bottom part built of your pyramid, you're going to find that the donors are not going to be attracted. They might give you a small gift, but they're not going to give you the really big dollars that you need to be able to scale. So we look at all of these 5 components and consider them the components of success. But as I mentioned, there is an order to each and every one of them. So if you have to start with that business plan, move to a budget, impact, and then the next. And this is something that I find really interesting. When we talk to nonprofits, 70% of them say they have absolutely no plan at all, no plan in place. They are doing operations. They may be doing operations very effectively. They may be meeting all of the deliverables of their grants, but they don't have a plan in place. And you look at then the statistic that says 92% of nonprofits will never break $1 million. And the $1 million in the nonprofit world is really kind of that threshold of small versus large. So one of the things that I think is a tell with this is that if you don't have a plan, if you're just doing good work, but you really can't articulate where you're headed, you really can't attract the big donors and do the big, hairy, audacious goals that you may have planned. So what are the elements of a really good plan? They have to have a really clear baseline starting point. This is where we are right now. Not just you as an organization, but the society, the issue that you're trying to solve. So if you're trying to solve a social justice issue, for instance, what is the current state of that issue right now in your community, in your country, wherever it might be? Where are you right now starting in trying to solve that problem? What are the challenges that you're facing? What is the challenges that the community is facing? The plan can't just be about your organization. It has to be a bigger community-based, operational-based plan. Because if you're just talking about your organization and the challenges of your organization, then you're not able to communicate how you're solving a bigger picture, which is what investors want to invest in. From having a start baseline, right now we have this many homicides that are happening, this many sexual assaults, this many people are homeless. Whatever the issue is, this many animals are abandoned annually. We have to have a clear goal of where we want to be. Where do you think you can be in 12 months from now? Where do you think you can be 3 years from now? And are those goals realistic? And then what will happen because you hit your goals? And this is, I think, one of the most important things. If we succeed, if our solution to whatever that big problem is that we're trying to solve is effective, what is the change that the community will see that is real outcome-based change? And then an accurate budget that covers the cost of implementation. If that implementation means a new building, it covers the actual cost turnkey of that building, everything you need to know, every desk, every human being, because people don't pay for bricks and mortar, they pay for what happens inside the building. And then ongoing implementation plan with goals and metrics that the team can use to drive this plan forward, usually built on a 90-day basis. That has to be a living, breathing piece of your day-to-day operations. It has to be how you coach your team. It has to be how you evaluate their performance. Everyone has to understand that those milestones, those metrics are critically important to driving the organization forward, and they may or may not be the goals and metrics that your funders ask for. These are really true meaningful outcomes and metrics that are meaningful to your organization. And as I mentioned, lots of organizations get hung up in this place. The true cost of doing business, and when I go in and I ask an organization, how much does it cost you to actually implement this program. Very, very few of those organizations can tell me how much it costs. They might think about, I had one just yesterday say to me, well, it doesn't cost us anything to do that. I'm like, yes, it does. Do you spend your time on that? Yes, I do. Well, then it costs you something. It costs you your time. It costs you payroll. It costs you admin overhead. It costs you your mileage to drive there. Whatever that might be, there is a cost to doing every single thing that you do as an organization. So what is that cost? How much does it really cost you to answer a hotline call? Or to go up and lobby, or not lobby, advocate for legislative policy change. All of those things have some sort of cost. The other thing that's important is that you're showing the replacement value at current market rate. Right now, we have a crisis in the social services industry and in the nonprofit world where we are not paying our staff market rate. Oftentimes, we have seen increases in CEO pay, but not in line staff. Or we have line staff pay going up. I've seen this where the CEO pay is not at current rate. If we're really truly social justice organizations, we have to be fighting for living wage salaries for our staff. And we have to be communicating that to donors. And our budgets need to reflect it. The other thing is you cannot have a year-to-year budget. You have to be projecting out, because if you're thinking in advance of what you want to do, you need to be thinking about what the staffing pattern is going to be on that. You need to be thinking about what growth you're going to need in terms of office space, in terms of marketing, in terms of fundraising expenses. So you have to be projecting out 2 to 3 years, and rarely do nonprofits do this. It's something that businesses always do. And I can tell you that when you go into a donor meeting, you show them a 3-year pro forma, their face will light up. You can also do this in a way that allows you to then easily write for grants. And in our Knowledge Center, we have grant templates that you can use. But it's really important that you're building out a multi-year plan and then using that multi-year budget to create your fundraising campaign. So Jane Goodall is someone that I really admire. Definitely an organization with founder challenges. She's got a fabulous executive director in Washington, D.C., but the challenge is, you know, she's just been so amazing and such a institution. But one of the things I love about Jane is, you know, her quote here that you can't get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. For me, it's not just about doing good things. It's about making sure that what we're doing is really having an impact. Are the actions that we're taking, the programs that we're offering, really having the impact that we think they are? And I sometimes use a slide of the programs DARE and GREAT, which is the drug awareness and resistance education program, which, believe it or not, is still in operation to this day. All of the research on that program shows that kids who take the program are more likely to use drugs than kids who don't take the program. And yet they continue to offer the program. They've spent millions on this program. Now they may have adapted it a little bit since when they first started these programs in the 80s, but it just goes to show you that sometimes we think we have a really great program and we think we're doing really good, but in fact, the work that we're doing isn't as good as we think it is. I often use the example of domestic violence shelters because I ran one for 10 years, and I saw a study that showed that domestic violence shelters, the research that they've been able to garner, that 75% of women who go into a shelter end up either homeless or back with their abuser. And this is, of course, a nationwide sample, but that's pretty horrifying. I don't think that we think that's what's happening. So are we really truly measuring and making sure that the work that we're doing is having the impact that not only we think, but that our clients expect? And success shows impact. So if we are successful, we're going to have impact. Again, I was working in a community. There was a homeless shelter that was reporting the great success that they were having. But when you pulled the numbers down and you actually started looking at outcomes, their jobs program had less than a 25% success rate. Now, I don't know that I would really consider that successful. So sometimes we want to say that our success is we use it in one way, in what I would consider to be outputs, but true success shows the ripple effect of your organization, the impact that you're having, and the permanent change that you're making in the world. And I always use this example of outputs versus outcomes. Outcomes, again, are that permanent change. Outputs are anything you can count on your fingers. If you can count it with a hash mark, it's either an input or an output. For instance, the number of people who sign up for a program is an input. The number of people who graduate is an output. Just because someone graduates from your program or exits your program does not mean that they were successful. How we measure whether or not someone's successful is what changes in their life from when they came in to now when they leave. Did they get a job? Did they get permanent housing? Were they able to live independently? Was there a permanent placement with a new family? Whatever that might be, that's what we're looking for, not just how many you've served. So next time you think about doing that impact report, and everything in that impact report is outcomes or outputs rather than outcomes, you need to rethink how you're communicating, because I can tell you it falls flat with donors. They really don't think, it does not cause them to want to give you larger dollars. They think you're busy, but you're not really hitting where they want to see you hit. And again, how do you really know what you're doing is making a difference? So when we talk about how we communicate, and again, outputs and outcomes, it's not that all of these things are not important, because they are. Typically, funders are asking for outputs. Now they're getting a little bit better and starting to ask for outcomes. But as you start to communicate the impact that your organization has, and you're thinking about this in your planning process and in the scope of what's in your toolbox, obviously you want to have your warm, fuzzy appeals. Everybody's writing those up because it's coming up on year end. Everybody's getting prepared for that letter with that picture that's going to really pull a heart tug. And maybe you're going to do an anecdotal example, tell a little bit about what the clients look like. Just surveys are, the percentage of people that say that they like your program or it benefited them. But when we really start to get into the economic impact, the number of people with jobs, the number of people who own homes, the return on investment, that because you are there, you're able to avert people going to jail or people becoming homeless. And then the customized or ROI is, how does this then relate specifically to partners in your community, whether that's taxpayers, other corporations, whatever it may be. But how do we communicate the return on investment for partners and key stakeholders and potentially donors in our community, so that they can understand how what you're doing is making a change to their bottom line as well? So I'll give you an example. When I first started communicating about fundraising and asking for money, I showed this chart, and I got up in front of our county commission and I said, in 2004 or 5, this is the amount of money that you gave us. here we are 10 years later, 8 years later, and you're basically still giving us the same amount of money. But look at the number of clients that we're serving. I thought in my mind that they would say, wow, you're serving so many more people, we should give you more money, that the money should follow the number of people that you're serving. And instead, you might guess what they said to me. Wow, look how efficient you're being with the money that we're giving you. We haven't changed the level of giving at all in 8 years, and yet you've managed to fundraise and be able to serve more. And then I had to fight the next year because they wanted to decrease my per client funding to reflect the increases that we were showing, which is exactly what I didn't want to have happen. So I changed the way that I communicated. But this was really thinking about outcomes, outputs, and ROI. We talked about the number of deaths. We talked about the number of hotline calls and 911 calls, and we talked about the economic impact of that. We were actually able to go in and pull what is the economic drain on responding to domestic violence. And we were able to show that the community was spending $24 million a year, just the crime portion of domestic violence in our community. So while they were giving us 181,000, they were spending $24 million a year on basically interventions that weren't working. Because you could see that year we had 27 homicides in one county. It was insane. We had several mass shootings in our community. So that shifted the way that I was telling my story. And ROI can be both the toll as well as the positive benefit. So I'm going to move on to the next part, which is once you've got your plan, you've got your budget, you got to have a team. And I don't know how many of you always feel like you have enough staff, but I think that's one of those things where you never have enough staff, right? You always wish that you had more staff members, you were able to pay your staff more. Well, you're not alone. 87% of nonprofits say that they do not have enough staff to do the work that they need to do. But if you don't have a plan to add staff, if you don't have with your budget a 3-year organizational chart of how you're going to grow that staff, whether it's just growing the pay or growing the number of team members in a strategic way, I kind of feel if you don't manifest it, it's not going to happen. So we may not have enough staff, but do you have a plan in place to show what staff you need and when you'll bring them on board and how much money you need to have by the time you do bring them on board so that it's a sustainable growth, not just grant-based. The other challenge is, do you have enough staff to raise funds? So 59% of organizations have less than one full-time person dedicated to fundraising. And oftentimes that less than one half person is the executive director or the CEO. And the reality of it is there's a huge difference between major gifts and special events. And oftentimes what happens is when you end up with an organization that has less than one full-time person dedicated to fundraising, or even if you have one person, you end up having someone who becomes either major gifts focused or grant or event focused. And usually they are event focused, which means that all of the major gifts, which is how you really move the needle on your fundraising, end up being put aside or laid at the feet of the CEO. So thinking through how are we going to raise funds is really important. And what are the roles that we have to take our fundraising to the next level? It's not just about adding more people. It's about strategically thinking about the types of gifts you want to be bringing in, where you're going to have your focus over the next 12 to 24 months, and making sure that you have a staffing pattern, whether it is volunteer or full-time or part-time, doesn't matter, even contract, making sure you have the right people in those positions, because you will not successfully fundraise without the right people focused on the right efforts. Someone who's very, very talented in event fundraising is not going to be good at major gifts fundraising for the most part. A major gifts officer, if you have them also doing events, will typically not be successful. So we don't want to set our fundraising people up to fail, which is what happens way too often, is we set them up to fail, expecting them to do basically two different types of jobs. And then we wonder why we have nationwide a 24 to 48 month turnover in development staff. It's because honestly, I don't think they know what they're supposed to do. And we haven't gotten to that point in the nonprofit sector like we have in the for-profit sector of specialization. And if you think about it, someone who goes out and sells at a Best Buy is a very different salesperson than somebody who sells at a Ferrari dealership. When you're thinking about those two types of folks, they're both valuable, they're both important. But if we have people who are really good at one thing and we're asking them to do something else, or asking them to be jacks of all trades in the fundraising arena, more than likely they're not going to be successful, or they're not going to be successful for very long. So really be thinking about that in your planning process. Who's going to do the asks? Sometimes you're fortunate enough to have board members, but unfortunately, only about 60% of boards have board members who fundraise. And when you ask, do 100% of your board members give, it drops to below 50%. And I kind of wonder about these two numbers. I think when they say, does your board fundraise, they're probably thinking it's board, like if anybody on your board fundraises, rather than the board, every member of your board. Because if your board isn't giving, if you don't have 100% board giving, and please feel free to take this clip and show it at your next board meeting. If you don't have 100% board giving every single year, it sends a red flag to your donors that something is going on inside your nonprofit that's wrong. And I really truly believe that give or get is not okay. They have to personally write a check. And if they're not willing to write a $50 check, if that's all they can afford, we're not talking about writing huge checks, we're talking about whatever level they can give. If they're not willing to write a personal check, whether it's from them or for their company, if they own one, there's a problem internally with your organization. And we have to start moving the expectation before people join our board and letting them know that they have to give an annual gift for this very reason, if for nothing else. If your board isn't 100% behind you, you're going to find that you're not going to have donors giving large amounts. It's a red flag. So let's talk succession planning. I showed a quote earlier from Jane Goodall, and she's done a great job of building an infrastructure in her organization. But when you have a founder, or when you have a high profile CEO who is well known in the community, it is critically important to have a very clear succession plan. It's also important to have a succession plan in place for each member of your team that is critical to your operations, as well as your board leadership. So why is this so critically important? If I'm going to give you $5 million, I want to know that if somebody decides that they've hit the lottery and they're leaving tomorrow, that the operations are still going to go forward. I see this a lot with smaller organizations that have teams of maybe 6 or 7, especially if they have a founder CEO who's not taking a full salary, and they're wondering why people won't invest. And I had a really large investor tell me one time, I will never, ever make a large gift to an organization when the CEO is not paid a full salary. because if they leave, something happens to that person, they'll never be able to replace them. So that is a conversation, even if the replacement of that executive director, CEO, is with a volunteer temporarily, there has to be a dedicated backup so that anybody who would write the larger check would have the confidence that the work, which is what they're funding, not the person, that the work would continue. So succession plans are really important, and 62% don't have one. So if you don't have a plan, we have a template, but get one in place. So what do donors want to see? They want to see at least one successful leadership transition. So if you've not had a successful leadership transition yet, then they want to see a plan to address any unfilled or significant positions if they become vacant. If they're already vacant, they want to see how you're planning on filling that position. All right, so the next piece that we're going to cover is cultivated donors to fund your project. So this is the top of the pyramid. So we've got our base, we've had the time, we've planned, we have a budget, we know how much money we need to raise over the next 3 years. We know what we're going to do if we actually are able to raise the money and execute on our plan. We have a plan to have the right team in place, including someone to fundraise for us. So who's going to fund it? How do we go out and find the donors who are not only donors that are prospects that are interested, but cultivated donors that will fund the project, that are ready for an ask? And I want to share one tool that we use. We partner with iWave software, which is a wealth screening fundraising software. It allows us to go in and do a whole host of wonderful things. And I wish I'd had this as an executive director because it's an amazing tool. It allows us to go in and develop prospect lists. We can identify people who give to other organizations that are similar to yours, or even that are in your community that are likely to give to your organization if you want to do acquisition. But we can also look at your current donors and really start to identify what is the specific challenge that your organization has and how you need to address that. So they look at 3 different things. Propensity, which is how frequently these individuals give, the likelihood that they're going to give. The affinity, which is the linkage to issues similar to yours. If you are an animal organization and somebody only gives to education, you're probably not going to get money from this person. If somebody only gives to human services, you're probably not going to get them to give to an arts organization. Not hard and fast rule, but it's pretty close. The other thing is, do they have the capacity? And I really always caution people when they look at screening tools these days, because often what we are finding is with the increases in the value of property and land, which are part of these wealth screens, the amount the person can give is often overweighted, I think. So you have to look at how much of their wealth is in real estate versus how much of their wealth is in disposable income. Having said that, what we look at then is, of your donors, where do they fall? What does the total potential capacity? So you can see this organization, which is a mock organization, obviously, has close to 10,000 prospects. Their prospects have about $115 million of giving capacity. That is amazing. And most organizations think they have to go to acquisition to bring in new donors, when oftentimes they have more than enough money sitting in their donor list. They just haven't evaluated those donors and then asked them for the right amount of money, or cultivated them to the point where they can ask them for the right amount of money. So this is a critical tool to have, because it costs a lot more money to go after new prospects than it does to go after ones that are already giving to your organization. And if you look at the propensity affinity and capacity ratings for this organization, you can see that the people who are giving to them have a high likelihood that they do give philanthropically. They have a tremendous amount of capacity. It's the 4s and 3s, which is what we want to see, are way up there. But the affinity isn't as high as we would like to see it. The affinity is only at about half 3 and 4s. So what we want to make sure that we're doing is focusing on making connections to our current donors so that we strengthen the affinity, how connected they feel to our organization. The beautiful thing about iWave is it actually allows us to identify what would be the best connecting activity. Are they a team? Should they be social? Is this someone who's not going to give a large gift? They're just an annual fund donor, and we really should just focus on keeping them giving on an annual basis. So it allows us to segment our donors based on size, based on how we should continue to cultivate and steward those donors, and gives us a strategy and a plan around how to build the ready to ask donor pool from our current donors. So having a tool like this is really important. If you don't have a tool like this, you can still do this with what we call an evaluation committee, where people sit down and talk about these 3 categories. Because this isn't rocket science. I mean, it's not 100% foolproof, but it's really a good tool to have something like this. And then we have to understand too about each one of our prospects. I have some donors that I have received 7-figure gifts, 8-figure gifts from, for various clients, for organizations that I worked for. And individuals will often say to me, oh, can you make an introduction to so-and-so donor? And my answer is always no, which is something you should always know about hiring a consultant. Consultants do not bring their relationships to you. They help you build your relationships. They might give you strategy around how to connect with that donor, but they are not going to bring their connections and introduce their connections to you. So when you think about hiring a local person, you're actually probably going to get less bang for your buck with a local person, because they might know some strategy around those individuals, but they're actually not going to make those introductions. Because if they introduced every single client every time they got a new client, that person would never take their phone calls. So what we do when we look at someone is they may have capacity. I have a client that is interested in Elon Musk. He has definitely capacity. We all know that he makes, I think I saw something recently that said $14 million a day, something obscene like that, or maybe that was Jeff Bezos, but tremendous capacity. That capacity, we also then want to know, is that income or wealth? So do they have a lot of money, but they're spending it a lot, so they're cash poor? Or do they have wealth, meaning they have lots of investments, they have lots of money, they could in fact give that money away? We want wealth, obviously, because if someone just has income, but all of that income is tied up either in land, in their business, or paying for their kids to go to college, we're probably not going to get a large gift from that person. Their concern. And I think this is both philanthropic concern as well as concern about your issue. This is the affinity piece. If there is someone who we have gone through this first screen and we have said, okay, this person has wealth, they could potentially make a gift. Now, are they philanthropic? Because the reality is some people just aren't very philanthropic. Or, as is the case with many people who are very wealthy, they have put up barriers so that they don't personally get asked for money all the time. For instance, you don't go to Elon Musk and ask him for money. He has a foundation. Mackenzie Scott has a foundation. People who are really wealthy, and I've even heard with Melinda Gates, you can either be Melinda's friend or you can ask her for money, but you can't have both. So they put up these barriers, because otherwise they would have nothing but people coming after them time after time, which is why many wealthy donors actually either only go through their foundations or donor advised funds, or they give anonymously. And I'm seeing that more and more where people don't want to put their names on things because then they just get assaulted with asks. So philanthropically, are they a giver, and what is that portal to give? And then is their concern with your particular issue light or heavy? And could you create philanthropic pillars that make that a stronger connection? I'm working with one of my clients who has a wildlife rescue. That wildlife rescue had only fundraised on rescuing wildlife. We then created additional pillars, one around tourism and economic impact, and another one around education, interns, the next generation of wildlife advocates, conservation, K through 12 education. So now they had 3 different pillars. Then we ended up creating a 4th pillar because they happened to be a living museum and they're building an educational facility. So we ended up with 4 philanthropic pillars so that we could tap in other concern areas that donors might have. If you have a domestic violence center, for instance, having a kennel is a great additional philanthropic pillar. Many people who don't necessarily want to give to domestic violence will give to a pet kennel, or so that people don't have to give up their pets to go into a domestic violence shelter. Those are the types of philanthropic pillars that you can be thinking about as you start to think about your outcomes, because each one of those philanthropic pillars needs to have really hard measurable outcomes to attract those donors so that it doesn't seem like mission drift. And then finally is connection. How is this person connecting with our organization? Nonprofits traditionally go for the emotional ask. People who give large gifts, either they don't just go for the emotional ask, they go for the emotional and the rational. The rational is, the emotional starts with, yes, I absolutely love the story you just told me. I really hear what you're doing and care about that. I have a lot of concern about this issue. The rational then comes in before they make that write that check. Do they have a plan? How much is this going to cost? Do we know what the outcomes are if I give them this investment? Those are the pieces that you have to have in place if you're going to move a donor through this qualification process and get them to the point where you are ready to make a major ask of a donor. All right. So I'm going to take questions, and I know I've gone over a lot of information today, but I want to take some questions, and also, let's talk about what might be next for your organization. Asking yourself, and I have you put the questions in the chat, or your answers in the chat, but how many of you currently have a business plan in place that you feel it qualifies under the criteria that I mentioned? You have a plan that is operationalized, it covers 3 years, it has clear outcomes, and it has a budget that matches it. Does anybody have a plan that you feel is that strong? Not seeing any hands go up. All right. How many of you have any kind of plan at all? Anything that's just a plan in place, that's something in writing that says this is where we want to be in 3 years? All right, you're proving my point, folks. Plans are critically important. If you don't have that bottom component of a plan, that is the best place to start. And start by inviting your community into that. I'm going to give you another piece of advice around planning. As you start to develop a planning process, adding in individuals in your community and asking their opinion is a great way to, 1, get in the door, and 2, engage them in the process of your organization planning for the future. It helps you understand who's wants to be involved, whether or not this person will eventually invest in your organization, and you can ask them, who else should you be talking to? The old adage goes, if you want to ask someone for money, ask them their opinion. If you want their opinion, ask them for money. So going out in your planning process and asking people for their opinion, asking them what they would like to see your organization do, what outcomes are important to them, is the first step in starting to have that opportunity to cultivate that person, engage that person, and move them up in that affinity, as well as the connection. All right, so who has questions for me? Anybody have any thoughts on, I've allowed you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. Anybody have any questions? Rosa.
Hi, Carol. I want to thank you for posting this webinar because it was very informative. Also, I want to thank you for using this formula as a former employee, because I can honestly say for those 4 years, I had a living wage and I did not know your formula. So this is very insightful to see what you did and how you navigated to ensure that your employees had a living wage, our basic needs were met. And I'm still amazed at how you raised that $10 million. And I'm gonna always follow you until I get your trick.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I know you're up in Atlanta these days, but yeah, I appreciate that. You know, I'm a firm believer that you know, if we're going to really say that we are, especially those organizations that say that they're a social justice organization, we can't legitimately say that we are doing social justice work and then pay our people so little that they have to be on Medicaid, or they have to have food stamps, or they qualify for child subsidies. There's something really wrong with that. And I know the realities of doing the work, but I think sometimes that we lose sight of that. And there is obviously an opinion that people who work in the nonprofit sector should be happy with whatever they get because they're getting the heart piece. But we also know the reality. We know the reality that working in the nonprofit sector is, you're going to have issues with secondary trauma. You're going to have issues just it's the hardest work you'll ever do. It is really the hardest work you'll ever do. So fighting for people's wages is really important, but also I think maintaining that balance between executive compensation and frontline staff wages, and making sure that that's balanced and fair as well. All of those issues are really important. So let's see, we've got something in the chat here. Thank you so much, Maureen. You don't have any questions, but I appreciate that. I think that having a plan of what your next steps are, I can tell you that really when I go in and work with organizations, we build these 5 components with the organization. It's amazing how fast they grow their revenue, which allows them to grow the work that they're doing. The planning is really critically important along with the budget, but we're doing some national outcome work now with some organizations. And the one thing that they really want to focus on is not what do funders want to see, but how do we know the work we're doing is really making a difference? You know, what is the primary outcome that we as an organization, if we didn't have any funders that we had to report to, what would we say is the most important outcome for the issue that we're trying to address? And how do we make sure that we're achieving that outcome? And if we're not, how do we correct? You know, do we shut a program down? if it's not having the impact that we think it's having. How do we communicate that and do the rigor around that? When you look on an international scale, measurement and evaluation is so important. It's a conversation that you hear all the time about measurement and evaluation. Not that it's done, not that it's really incredibly effective, but the one thing that I have learned is that when it's being done, especially in the global South, it really is focusing more on the outcomes than it is the outputs, and really stepping back and saying, is this work affecting the climate change? Is this effect, driving down the number of people that are trafficked every year? Is the work that we're doing working? So I don't know if each one of you can answer that question in the positive, but I think that's an important piece of it, is making sure that the work that you're doing is in fact having the impact that you think it is. Any other questions? Just about at the top of the hour. I know we had a little extra time if we had more questions, but looks like lots of people signed up and are expecting to get this in a video format, which is great as well. Feel free to reach out to us if you do have any questions. We have a new website that's getting ready to be launched. It was supposed to be launched in March, but we're still working on it, as you can imagine, how those things go. If you have any questions, or if you need any help with any tools, we have lots of free stuff on our website, lots of templates, tools, and videos on our YouTube channel. And we're always looking for extra things to do for folks. The next webinar series that we're going to be doing is on succession planning. We have a couple of clients that have done truly amazing CEO transitions. One was a founder, actually both were founders. One has done 2 successful transitions, one not as a founder and one as a founder. The other one just did a successful transition as a founder, and really highlighting how you can make that process just smooth and positive so that the organization continues to thrive. So we'll be launching that webinar series very shortly. We'll also be opening up our spring cohort. We filled our fall cohort pretty quickly, but we have a spring cohort that walks you through over 6 months each one of these components, and allows you to, with a group at a lower cost rate, be able to build all of these components for your organization. So if you're interested, again, feel free to reach out to us at Sharity, myself or one of my team members. I'd be happy to talk to you about how we can help your organization grow and become sustainable. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.